The story of Thomas Holloway. His life and his legacy. It will take us across the country and across the continent. We will witness opulence up close, explore the underbelly of 19th century life, and map a story that continues to affect thousands of people every single year. But it all begins in a rather unlikely place. My name is John Davies, and I've lived in Egham both as a student and a member of the community for years now. My own Holloway story has taken me through many highs and many lessons, but one thing is for certain. It has been an adventure. So, I look forward to following along on Thomas Holloway's adventure, to see the places that inspired him, and to understand the man who tricked his way into building a better world. We begin in the west of 19th century England, a setting not unfamiliar to its fair share of intriguing tales. But our story is not as famous as Far From the Madding Crowd or Hounds of the Baskerville. No, our story remains relatively unknown, even by those who live amongst its legacy every day. Thomas Holloway is not a name that tends to come up on many pub quiz history rounds. And yet his name was once on cabinet shelves across the British Empire, and his fortune raised two of the most spectacular buildings in all of Victorian England. So where do we begin? A bakery, a pub, and a very good idea. The 22nd of September, 1800, Devonport. The dominoes were laid out, and Thomas Holloway was born. This area, once called Plymouth Dock, was famous primarily for its seafaring characters. In the late 17th century, a man named Robert Waters from Portsmouth was given a contract from the Admiralty to build a dock on this land. Eventually, Plymouth Dock grew into its own large settlement, and today, now known as Devonport, it became part of the wider city. Our story, the Holloway Story, is characterized by excessive wealth and extravagant buildings. This area, unfortunately, was not. But there was a hard-working community man that lived and worked here with his wife Mary. His name? Thomas Holloway. However, this Thomas was not the protagonist of the Holloway story we are about to embark on. No, this Thomas Holloway, Sr., is his father. Thomas Sr. was a man who understood the rhythms of business, of early mornings and daily deals. Trade, produce, exchange, these were the words spoken at the Holloway dinner table. But the family would not stay. In 1811, when Thomas was just 11 years old, his father uprooted the household and moved further west, to the very tip of Cornwall, Penzance. There, Thomas Sr. became the owner of an inn. But it wasn't any old boozer. The Turk's Head is one of the oldest inns in England. It has stood where it stands today since the 13th century, through plagues, civil wars and revolutions, as well as COVID, Brexit, and the end of the Elizabethan age. An exciting time for Thomas Sr., but for his son, it was another step further from London, the heated heart of Victorian Britain. Thomas Jr. received a modest education, but a thorough one. He was highly literate, numerate and sharp, three things the world would demand of him. And he grew ever more ambitious, hearing stories from fishermen and adventurers coming through the door of his father's inn. As a teenager, he decided he couldn't sit on his hands any longer. In 1816, at just 16 years old, Thomas began an apprenticeship at a local druggist, inspiring him to experiment with his own concoctions in his mother's kitchen. The vibrant world of Victorian medicines, compounds, preparations, cures and remedies had just entered Thomas Holloway's life for the very first time. The first domino had dropped. This was a different Britain to the one we know today. The Napoleonic Wars were over, the empire expanding, and the Industrial Revolution was reshaping Victorian life from within. This was an age of ambitious individuals who would do anything to make a name for themselves, no matter the means. Thomas Holloway was one of them. The bakery and the inn had given him two things to carry with him throughout the rest of his story: an instinct for commerce and a life spent watching people come and then watching them go. But young Thomas knew very early on that the world was larger than Plymouth, that the world was larger than Devonport, larger even than that Cornish pub he spent his childhood years in. And so he decided to leave. Most young men who left the countryside in the 19th century headed for London. Thomas Holloway came to France. By 1828, Thomas had crossed the Channel and made it to the north of France. He spent around 3 exciting years here, moving between two very different towns. The first was Dunkirk, but what would life have been like for young Thomas?
Dunkirk as a port town, that maybe would have been something that he could identify with and engage with as somebody who'd grown up in the southwest. It's really fascinating to think what would an Englishman in the 1820s have made of the north of France in that period.
Goods moved through this harbour constantly. Wool, textiles, coal, people, ideas. Languages blurred into one another here at the dockside. French, Flemish, English, Dutch. This was not the quiet corner of Cornwall that he was used to. But Thomas had to seek compromise to find work out here. The unruly extravagance of Victorian druggery was far more conservative on the continent, so he honed his French and became a secretary and interpreter. He had a diverse pool of clients: merchants, agents, importers, perhaps reminding him of those eccentric characters that would guzzle down Cornish pints in his father's inn. But it wasn't all so professional. Dunkirk had a seedy side. Here, Thomas met no shortage of pubs that were more than happy to serve this young Englishman.
Dunkirk probably seems more like the kind of place, particularly since it's had a long experience of sailors and visitors and indeed Englishmen, where you can kind of have your fun.
He developed a circle of friends, all too keen to gather around the roulette wheel and burn through the French francs they had left in their pockets. However, it is said that Thomas looked back on these days fondly, even into his old age. It is certain, then, that this port town broadened his horizons. But if Dunkirk was Thomas's window onto the wider world, then Roubaix was his classroom.
Dunkirk really takes off as a major port in the second half of the 19th century, so kind of after 1850. At this time, it's probably, we can say it's kind of ticking along, whereas Roubaix is a place where things feel like they're really moving. You've just got the first steam engines being installed. As we mentioned, the population is growing, the industries are developing.
In the 1820s, Roubaix was in the middle of a transformation. Textile mills were rising from the ground. Workers were pouring in from Belgium, the French countryside, everywhere that pushed them to work. The population was booming.
We can imagine him, I guess, moving to Roubaix and finding that this is a place where things are really happening, things are really moving, and he can get more serious about business and, yeah, kind of taking part in something that's new and exciting, perhaps even.
Picture Thomas Holloway arriving here for the very first time, a baker's son from Devon who grew up above a Penzance pub, now in his late 20s, fluent enough in French to pass, but still an outsider, still someone watching the room from afar rather than commanding it. We cannot know exactly what he felt, but we can make a reasonable guess. He may have felt small, he may have felt hungry. That ambitious spirit was not gone yet. In Dunkirk, Thomas had now seen the whole world in one town, all its vibrancies and all its vices. And in Roubaix, the second domino had struck. Here, the people boasted their businesses. Printed posters circled the town, and newspaper articles were printed in bold black ink. The boy, who had grown up watching strangers come and go through his father's inn, understood, perhaps for the first time, that the story you told about your product was just as important as the product itself. Perhaps, he thought, even more. There is something else worth saying about these years. Thomas Holloway spent 3 years away from England, largely alone, building himself into someone new. But his family was soon about to come back into the picture, and his life was to be uprooted forever. Thomas Sr., the hard-working father and small-town community man, died suddenly. His adventure in the north of France and his years of independence had come to a crashing close. Thomas's world had been shaken, but he got back on his feet, and he knew what must be done. Thomas had to leave France and return to England. Using the money he had earned as an interpreter and the inheritance from his father, he used the money to move his family to London in search of maintaining the momentum he had found on the continent. At 31 years old, he had no product, no business, and no name that anyone in England would recognize. Just ambition and contacts. Thomas threw himself into the city's engine, first finding that same work that he had trained for in France, later establishing his own company for exporters and importers, utilizing those continental contacts he had established during those late nights in Dunkirk. Thomas moved between offices, translated letters, and carried messages about for some people who had some serious money. But by 1836, Thomas was growing restless. This life, he felt, was no longer serving his ambitious self. He decided it was time to stop working for other people and embark on his next adventure. In the early 19th century, London became the first city since ancient Rome to reach a population of 1 million people. By the end of that century, that population had soared to over 5 million. This was a city and a time where if you had an idea, the right idea, you could become incredibly wealthy. But it wasn't always so rosy. With such rapid development, many were left behind, and inequality in the capital grew just as fast as the factories were being built. Thomas Holloway, a man not from particularly comfortable upbringing, knew this. The same type of people who would sit in his father's pub drinking ale and telling stories was soon to make him very rich. But one man stood out amongst the London crowd.